Let me first greet you and welcome you to our session, Traditional Buildings and Settlements in Track B. I don't see announcements. So if there will be any announcements, I think Lindsay or Hisham will send it to me. The first thing I would like to advise participants in the IAST conference to observe the rules and conduct that are already there on the website of the program. I also want to remind you that you have 20 minutes to make the presentation. As a chair, I will let you, before your time is off, 3 minutes, I will change my background into yellow. I'll try to announce it in a way that doesn't interrupt you. Then if 1 minute before your time is off, I'll change into red, my background into red. Please hold your questions and comments. Try to put them in the chat to the presenter, and I'll hope that we have the time for you to make the questions and our colleagues to respond to your inquiry or your comments. If not, then I hope that they will get in contact with you through email or something like that. Let me first, we have 4 presentations. The first is by Dr. Jiang Ren, who is a lecturer in architecture at the University of Sheffield School of Architecture, focusing on architectural anthropology and contemporary design in the historic built environment. His research works were shortlisted for RIBA President's Research Awards in 2014 and 2016 and appeared in journals including Architectural Research Quarterly, Architecture and Culture, and Scroopy Cambridge Architecture Journal. Our second participant from India, Sweta Kendari. She's from the School of Planning and Architecture, India. She graduated from the CEPT University, Ahmedabad, and is currently working as an assistant professor at the School of Planning and Architecture, Bhopal, India. Her research revolves around understanding various narratives, transitions, and historical linkages between communities and their influences on the built environment. Her other areas of interest include an inquiry into various resilient rebuild approaches and consensus design. Our third presentation comes also from India. Ms. Nisha Subramanian, I hope I pronounced it right, from the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology, India. She has been involved in community development and working with women artisans in the Kululu Valley for over 7 years. Her interest in traditional craft and how it can fit into modern lifestyles of artisans while still maintaining its cultural context has motivated her to explore the weaving and vernacular traditions of Himshal in depth. She is currently completing her doctoral research at the Srishti Institute of Art, Design and Technology. She's also part-time faculty at the same institution and the Center for Environment Planning and Technology, University, Ahmedabad. Lastly, but not least, we have Anjali Mittal presenting a paper that she co-authored with other colleagues. She's from the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, India. She is a researcher and an urbanist and an academician with over 13 years of experience in India and the UK. She believes that an interdisciplinary approach to spatial design is the key to build a socially responsive, efficient, sustainable human habitat. She has a wide range of experiences, both in the urban and rural context and public and private sector. I think now it's time for our first presenter, Dr. Jiang, to start his presentation. And you've got 20 minutes. Actually, it's 17 before I change my background.
Yes, sure. Just checking, Ahmad. So I start from 35. I will be finishing by 55. Right. Bear with me for shift. Could you see my title page? Sorry, again.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I'm Xiangren from University of Sheffield. Great pleasure to join this great conference. And my title is on Chinese Ancestral Hall. So my starting inquiry is what makes Chinese Ancestral Hall and how can we read this Ancestral Hall building as one of the most important archetypes of Chinese traditional architecture, but also its society. There are many different diverse architecture languages and construction techniques of ancestral halls throughout China, in particular in South China and Southeast China, but that is not my focus of this presentation. And instead, I'm focusing on how Chinese ancestral hall works, both in terms of use and in terms of meaning for those migrant displaced communities, based on a case study of 2 examples in the same region. I'm going to define and reinterrogate this archetype from 3 lenses. First is idea, and second is type, and thirdly, ancestral as a practice. So this is the image of a typical sample of family clan genealogy of a family clan in the area, and you can see it spanning from the very first ancestor to the 21st generations with many subdivided families. So they all share the same ancestor. And this is a key commonality where ancestral began as a place for collective ancestral worship. So this also links to the very important idea of family lineage system, which I draw most of all from David Forrest's works, and particularly the idea of shaping homeland. And to paraphrase, to extend from this idea, and I think the key for Chinese ancestral hall is about that homecoming. It's about to making and constructing the home and the self and the identities. So to also reference our last keynote speaker, Professor Ho, in one of his very earlier book chapters on Chinese ancestral hall, and it is architecture statement of the strength of lineage. So that strength is important because the stronger a clan lineage was, the closer their families with the same surname would live together, and so the larger size and scale of the settlement. So in general, every lineage village had at least an ancestral hall. And there's a local stance that if there's no ancestral hall, then there's no lineage. If there's no lineage, then there's no common ancestors. So there's no collective spiritual routine for that specific group. So we can see that ancestral hall is beyond physical representation or symbolic representation of the clan lineage, but it is a social spatial practice by the clan members. And this is something collectively constitute the idea of ancestral hall, which is by necessity rather than by aesthetics. And in this sense, it also links to the idea of multiple authorships led by clan leaders and clan members, but also carpenters, masons, feng shui masters in traditional China, and also fit within a very specific temporal dimension understood by traditional Chinese rural societies that is based on the Chinese lunar calendar, divide a year into 24 points rather than 12 months in modern industrial time. To summarize ancestral hall as an idea, it is a social cultural construct. It is a specific form of spatial identification and physical symbolism of a lineage in Chinese traditional clan society. And secondly, as I said, to look at Chinese ancestral as a type, in terms of its very earliest original appearance in the Chinese history, and it was in Han Dynasty around 200 BC to 200 AD. developed from Song dynasties and flourished at its peak during Ming dynasties around 16th century in terms of its numbers, volumes, sizes, typologies, scales, and institutions, which is very important for ancestral. We will see later on because it is a solidification of that clan institutions. But that, unfortunately, this specific type started to decay from the late Qing dynasties, 18th century, because of the internal wars and other political reasons. So the key vision of ancient Chinese family and displaced clans is about longevities and about prosperities of their families. So they facilitate the establishment of clan institution of the lineage system, and that related to those ancient archetypal temples in China, like the Bright Hall, or like those royal halls to sacrifice the heaven and the earth. And you can see from this early stone rubbling and that kind of archetypal type form of ancestral hall with a enclosure with two wings and layout in a U-shaped. So that is the very beginning of this form of type in architecture. And mostly and generally, ancestral halls are constituted by 5 bays, 5 to 7 bays, and by 3 to 7 depths. And you can see this diagram of the type form of ancestral hall. And there are, in general, 3 main halls: the hall of arrival, the hall of worship, and the hall of benchjumper, and then punctured by 4 void spaces. I would say first is the one enclosed by screen wall, and then there are 2 skyway spaces and a more private opening space to the end of the ritual axis. So this is a basic type form, and also relate to the orientation and location of ancestral hall, normally relate to the ancient Chinese cosmological idea of the power. The power sits on the laws, and normally ancestral is sit from north to the south. And this one, the one that I'm going to show, is a special one, which is from west to east. There's a reason for that, also related to temporalities. And also there's a topological relationship between the hall and the room, and in terms of the placement of the posts, the columns, the structure order, and the visual corridor, and the spatial organization, which will be the focus of my case studies. So thirdly, ancestral as a practice. And in general, there are 6 forms of collective practice for ancestral hall as a ritual form of architecture. The first one is to compile, store, and update genealogy, as you can see from the image. And this obviously was not historical ones, but visual representations from later artistic works or movies. And then the second is about teaching and learning linealogy rites through this written-based genealogy, by reading, by disseminating knowledge, by teaching, and by trying to empowering its clan men's and younger members of the clan to understand that shared identity of this lineage system. So this is a first 2 major collective practice in terms of ancestral hall, more related to discipline. And then the third is about meetings and the court. So it is also a place for the clan to sort out the conflicts between the clan members. And it is also like a private court to make punishment, but also to make encouragement. So then there are also used as a place for meetings, because normally the traditional Chinese clan, they shared lots of clan lands, and that needs to be met in terms of return or rent or continue, or also some arguments with other villages. So it is also a place for meetings by all the adults from the clan village. And number 4 is about celebration of festivals, which obviously about that more annually, temporally based celebration of springs and festivals related to the agriculture practice, harvest and seeding. And this is a very important place to gather all clanmen together in the same place to celebrate. The final 2 collective practice of ancestral hall, one is related to rites of passage. In terms of the born, in terms of growing up, in terms of disease, passed away, and all this kind of fundamental rites of passage of a human being needs to be associated with the physical space of ancestral hall. So they need to be passed across ancestral hall with specific ritual procedures. And the final practice about ancestral hall is about scholarship and education. It's about teaching, about the idea of encouragement of the younger generations to work hard on their studies and to mostly go out to become officials in the imperial Chinese systems, and then coming back to the villages and to support the village development. So it's about scholarship, about education. So in this sense, ancestral hall can be seen as a practice, not only just as an idea and as a type. So I'm going to focus on two examples in the same region here in the red dot, traditional Hui prefecture, mostly in the southern part of Anhui province, but also in the nearby adjacent province, which you can see from the bottom right picture, the symbols, the image of this kind of traditional Hui prefecture, and mostly architectonic forms in black and white, and introverted, very, very defensive wall types, and light wells, sky wells punctured into this solid mass, very expressive celebration of the nature. The water mouse now is covered by all the lotus in a picture, and then the single gateways through the bridge and the coherence kind of harmony with the distant mountains. So this is the idea of the kind of traditional Hui prefecture and its architecture. Ancestral Hall is one of its most important public buildings. And this one, the kingship law one in Chenkan village, mostly did in 16th century and with the following extension later on. This is the village started from around 10th century and based on the I Ching yin-yang mapping of the village. So it has a very strong feng shui pattern relating to the mountain and the water, and the whole village consisting of around 100 lanes, and also with this water mouse, which you see as the entrance space of arrival of the village. The location of Ancestral Hall is at the edge of the central part of the village, circulated by the waterways and highlighted in red, and you can see there are two one covered and the other not covered lanes directing to the ancestral from within the village. But then there's also a more public open space to the north of the ancestral hall, welcoming those from outside. Sections, plans, and facades of ancestral hall, which we will dig out a bit more later on. Plan axometric from west to the east. So you can see to the west, there's a river and there's lots of flooding issues in history. And that's why this ancestral was chosen to confront the waterfront with a solid screen wall to block the qi, the active energy, losing from the ancestral, but also more practically to prevent the ancestral being flooded by the river. So that is the key reason for the very special orientation of this ancestral, but all the other ideas and typological articulation and also practice in the ancestral stays the same with others. The curved screen wall, a social space for the villages because you can pass across without entering into the ancestral hall. So it is a space of mixture of those profane and also those sacred. Very enclosed, as I said, it got that link to the blocking ceremony in Chinese clan system, and they had two side gateways for people to navigate, and also then you can have access to the ancestral halls through the central axis. 5-base stone archway with wooden shuttles, so that block people physically but visually collected. This is the starting marking point of the ritual progression into the more sacred land. Centralized access can be seen from this view. It's more dominated for the visitors and establishing that sense of very strong direction and orientation. And usually this central door will not be open. And normally you will only to access from the right door for the issues like paying the rent for the land from the clans, for example, but also storage. So when you enter into this layer of the ancestral, in terms of these two twin structures for inscription pavilions And this is getting more and more secretized. And not everybody can get into this point unless in the falling into the 6 practices of ancestral mentioned before. The ritual gateway, very ritualized ones, 7 base extended frontalities, about 26 meters width and 10 meters depth, and reach height around 10 meters. So it is the scale already beyond the human scale, other than the first several layers. And the same central door only open in ceremonial times, and only 2 side doors for clansmen to access during the festivals even. The main assembly courtyard, 20 plus 20, 400 square meters with a capacity of 400 clansmen, but I think it will be more. And that is from a historical archive. Presumably it will be much more, around 500 or even 600. And 4-meter width central pathway with different pattern of the pavement leading into the most important space of the ancestral worship. And interestingly, there's a tree with 400 years old now on the right side of this central axis, nearby the kitchen part, because presumably when kitchen was used to prepare the food for sacrifice, and this tree can provide a very decent shade for the clan worshippers in the warm climate of this region. So you go further, half of this central courtyard will be nearer to the platform for sacrifice, which is here, about 50 meters width, 5 meters depth. And the important thing is about its height, level change, 2 steps higher than courtyard and then 1 step lower than the hall. And normally you place those sacrifices here and being asked to enter into the worship hall to meeting the ancestors spiritually. It's a transition space. And again, another layer threshold between the transition space of sacrifice and to the space of meeting the ancestral, but also it is a service route for kitchen to prepare the food transmit to the people. Threshold space, again, entering into the hall of worship. This is a layer of 22 lattice wooden doorways. The most important part of the ancestral hall, the hall of worship, centralized, solemn, and it's claimed has a capacity of nearly 1,000 people, which will be very crowded in some rare times, but mostly will be only coming one by one to meeting the ancestral hall, doing the worship or doing the meetings by those clan leaders. The view from inside to outside, the space under the eave before the courtyard when you go into the final depths of the courtyard. And this is the one between the worship hall and the chamber hall. And for this case, there's also a book storage on top of the chamber hall, which you can see from this one after the colonnade space of transition. 11 bays, very splendid articulation and decoration of the scheme. And this is very private and normally not accessible by those worshippers, but only be accessible by a specific group of clan people in charge of the books, the knowledge. And it is a knowledge of the lineage. As I said, so it's a practice of the knowledge, an idea of the knowledge, not only a building type. The second case I will go through a bit quicker, the family hall of the Selim Hu in 17th century in another village, in a boat-shaped village, sandwiched by 2 rivers and still following the architectonic typological languages of traditional Hui prefecture architecture. And this is the plan. And you can see a hybrid type of 2 parts. The yellow part is official, more ancestral hall part, and the red part is more private and domestic. So it's a hybrid mixture, which hopefully can give a complementary view to the more formal ancestral hall in the first case studies. The street front courtyard, hall of arrival, skywell first, hall of worship, the second skywell, hall of Ben Chapel, and the final skywell, always following this central ritualized axis. The street space, and this one is outward facing and directing to the street, more welcoming. The gardens in the front for children to play, but also for social by the clansmen before the more memorial entry into this hall through this gateway, very solid and expressive stereotomics articulations. Hall of arrival, screen wall again, navigate into the skywell, looking into the hall of worship. Centralized
1 minute.
furniture. Yeah, I will be finishing 2 minutes.
1
Skywell
minute.
again and hall of Bedchamber. More or less very similar spatial organization of the type. So I think to very quickly wrap up, the above two small journey across the two ancestral halls indicates, first of all, how the spatial organization for this building reflects the social organization of the lineage, how they are spatially collected, you can see, and how it helps to frame the practice, the collective practice for the ancestral worship, and what does it mean? So this is
thank you, Dr. Ren. Thank you, Dr. Ren. Your time is over. Thank you very much.
I've got 1 more minute, Ahmed, because I begin 35 and it is 54, sorry.
It's 55 here in front of me.
Oh, 55. Okay, 54 for me, but I can stop if you like.
Thank you very much for your kindness.
No problem, okay. With pleasure.
Let's move to the next presenter. I think you'll have the time to respond to the questions and comments. Now we have Sweta and Dari. Are you ready? Go.
Is my screen visible and am I audible? I'll just confirm that.
Yes, yes. Go ahead.
Yes. Yeah, thank you. So hi, namaste everybody for attending this session. Thank you so much. And I would also like to thank the IST team for giving this opportunity to be here and for their efforts to organize this despite numerous challenges. Thank you. Today my presentation will talk about the fourth wall of Ahmedabad, focusing on the continuity, changes and adaptations that has taken place since its construction. The presentation is structured in 4 parts, beginning with the history of the fourth wall, followed by Patrick Geddes' note on the wall city written in 1950, which happens to be the only detailed description of the fourth wall and its surrounding areas. We shall compare it to the present condition and end the PPT with some thoughts for discussion. The city of Ahmedabad was founded in the year 1411. It is located in the western region in the state of Gujarat. The image to the extreme right shows us the extent of the walled city of Ahmedabad, which is on the eastern banks of Sabarmati River, that defines the city limits. In 2017, the city of Ahmedabad was declared as the first heritage city of the country by the World Heritage Committee. Ahmedabad's history can be divided into the Sultanate period, the Mughal period, the Marathas, the Britishers, and the post-independence period. In the upcoming slides, we will look at each period, and the information is collected through various archival sources that was organized in this timeline according to scholars or visitors' diaries and reports. The calamities that may have impacted the structural condition of the wall, the records and repairs of demolition that led to its transformation. For this presentation, we'll look only for a couple of them, and the red color will depict the demolition and changes, and the green will denote the description or attempts to repair the fourth wall. So the city was founded in 1411, about 600 years ago, by Sultan Ahmad Shah. The city is named after him. The fourth wall encapsulating the city was completed in 1487 by Muhammad Begera, who was his grandson. To commemorate its completion, the city, whoever is within is safe, was inscribed on the fourth wall. Duarte Barbosa, a Portuguese officer, while comparing it to Champaner, another city, says that Ahmedabad was much greater than the former. It was during the Sultanate rule that the wall and its gates were completed along with other iconic structures in the city. Under the Mughal rule, which lasted for 165 years, the city flourished most and hosted several visitors. The German traveler Mendelssohn mentions that there was a moat around the fourth wall. He described that the city had 12 gates, and through his writings, we understand that the city was surrounded by a ditch or a moat that was 16 fathoms broad, which is around 30 meters. So, however, in 1638, this was in ruins and did not have any water. Several descriptions are also found in the Gazetteer that confirm the presence of this ditch. So the image here shows us the city space in yellow, the walls and the 12 gates that we see in color red. The blue color shows us the Mahuda gate, which was shut due to its association with some ill omen and was never really used by the people of the city. The Marathas, who then had the rule in Ahmedabad, started entering the city from these two gates. And for around 18 years, there was a joint Mughal Maratha rule. And the 6 gates towards the south of the city were under the Maratha rule. So it is only this section in the city that has temples which are adjacent to the fort wall. We'll see some pictures later in the presentation. Now, in 1755, the Peshwas and Gaikwads were the two Maratha groups that captured the citadel and entered the Mughal and ended the Mughal rule. Several texts mention the injustice and the exploitation during the Maratha period that brought the city to a state of poverty and desolation. The suburbs became deserted. General Goddard, a British official, entered the city in 1781 from the Khan Jahan Gate, and the city was given control to the Gaikwads. During this time, James Forbes and John Dunlop reports said that the city was in a state of decay, deprived of its richness and splendor, from which it seemed doomed never to recover. And the walls were in the state of ruins and a resort for thieves and highwaymen. This map shows the location of the gate to the south or west of the city where General Goddard entered from. And in this image, we see the cannonball used at the time on the walls of the Khan Jahan Mosque, built in the 16th century, who also completed the fourth wall of the city. So in this image, we can see the plaster fillings of the cannonball marks done by the authorities that maintain this. So earlier this was under the Archaeological Survey of India, but is now managed by the religious group in the city. However, this is listed as grade 1 building by the Gujarat Gazette. Moving on to the British period, unlike many other cities in the world where the colonial government played a dominant role in its transformation, the city of Ahmedabad differed. There was a constant contestation for hegemony between the local leaders and the government. The indigenous, financial, and mercantile elites who acted as political leaders played a major role in its restructuring. The first collector of the city imposed taxes on salt, land, and import-export goods. He also proposed a new tax called house tax to cover the repairing damages of the wall. However, the leading people of the city, who were the merchants, financiers, and traders, opposed the idea of tax and agreed to volunteer and commit themselves by undertaking duties to repair the wall. These group of people felt that the government engineers were too expensive and suggested to give repair contracts to the locals by setting up a local committee called the Town Wall Committee, which was a predecessor to the Ahmedabad Municipal Commission. The intent of this committee was to administer the repairs to the fort wall. The merchants and the traders of the city voluntarily raised funds for repair, and this was called the Town Wall Restoration Fund. The restoration work took 12 years and was completed in 1842 with a cost of 25,000 euros, which is 2.5 lakh Indian rupees. After the wall was in excellent condition and was constantly repaired and maintained by this committee. The committee, after the repair, was not dissolved, but their duties were enhanced until the Britishers felt it was a threat for their government, and they opposed then the idea of a local committee and insisted on implementing taxes to raise funds. As per the new act of the government, another committee was comprised of the government officials and local administration, and all the decisions were taken based on these two committees. Now, after the dismissal of the Town Wall Committee, the locals formed another committee which was called the Ahmedabad Association, which put forth the wants of the people. They drafted several petitions to complain against the new commission that was formed, criticizing the overtaxation and hefty fines. Now, during this time, there were several mills that opened in the city, and the number of people per square mile in the city of Ahmedabad was greater than in Bombay and double than that of in London. This led to increase in the population of air and soil, pollution in air and soil due to dyeing, tanning, pottery, and other factories. The congestion and the unhygienic living conditions gave rise to diseases, leading to an alarming increase of deaths. Improvising sanitary condition and congestions became the primary concern of the government. To relieve congestion and to facilitate movement, the British government added 2 new gates to the east of the city wall called the Prem Darwaza and the Panchkua Darwaza. Highly inspired by the British Housing and Town Planning Act, the government started proposing ideas to demolish the wall And a lot of local leaders then opposed, the elite leaders rejected the wall demolition scheme, which was called the city wall scheme at the time. They rejected it on economic grounds and stated that it was incompatible with the social realities of the city. The proposal of this scheme also led to various public protests and political unrest. Unlike the colonial government, afterwards, when the local government came into power, earlier they did oppose the demolition plans, but later on, considering the expansion and for the improvement plans that they had, they kind of proposed another plan for city wall demolition. So in this plan, the people did not have to incur any extra taxation, and they realized that they would have to modify the earlier plan so that it would blend with the social and economic realities. Miriam's, whose earlier plan was rejected, was consulted again for a new plan. This time, a careful attempt was made to avoid controversial aspects of the previous plan. For example, the revised plan proposed mere acquisition of private properties. It did not impose the citizens to relocate themselves or to move in order to compromise for the development. In addition to this, the betterment tax was kept lower than the earlier proposed scheme. It finally received approval of the people, and the modified city wall was implemented, and most of the wall to the north and the east was demolished for expansion and improving city conditions. Next, we'll look at Patrick Geddes' notes on Ahmedabad. So he was called to India by the governor of Madras and was appointed by the British government and several princely states. And he gave detailed reports of about 50 cities and towns in India. The Bombay presidency at the time appointed Geddes to give his views on the demolition of the fort wall. And he made a 3-day visit in April 1915, almost about a century ago. And his notes on the city is the only description that we have of the fort wall and its surrounding areas. So in his report, Geddes extensively describes the city wall and dismisses the issues of ventilation and light, which the earlier demolition plan of the wall suggested. Keeping into consideration the tradition, history, and local customs, he suggested minor improvisations. And in Geddes' report, he strongly opposed the removal of the fort wall and suggested his philosophies of diagnosis and conservative surgery to improve the wall conditions. He also suggested 2 strategies, which was the Civic Museum and the Civic Survey for the city of Ahmedabad, that would exhibit Ahmedabad's past, present, and the possible. However, his proposals were ignored and most of the walls got demolished in 1924. So throughout history, the west wall of the city was never under the threat of demolition, as it acted as a defense against the river and a retailing wall to the city. The west stretch of the fort wall remains mostly intact, and we have ongoing restoration work by the Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation. And in his report, Geddes described that there were certain openings in this stretch of the wall, and temples were made for people to connect with the river, which at the time flew along the wall, the city wall. So what remains today are some gates managed by the Archaeological Survey of India, the west wall, some bastions, and some dilapidated fragments of wall across the city. So from here on, we will look at this stretch of the city wall and the certain adaptations done by people in this stretch. So this is the zoom part of the protected monuments as submitted in the dossier for the World Heritage nomination. So these are certain selected monuments by the experts, and this region was studied in detail. So we'll be focusing on these 3 zones further. So, and it was found that there are more bastions on sites and there are other several historic structures. So we will be walking this street from left to the right. Yeah. So this is the image where we enter the city from the southwest corner. This is called the Parput Darwaja, which means across the fort wall. It has layers of history that shows different architectural additions of different time period of the Sultanate, of the Mughals, and the Marathas. We also see a temple. So these 3 pictures are of different time period. And we can see how people have changed and adapted with respect to the changing architecture and rulers of the time. And the lowest bottom where we see a rectangle is the Khan Jahan Mosque, where when General Godard entered, we saw the cannonball marks can be seen on the walls of that mosque. Now, behind the mosque, there's a contemporary structure, which acts as a madrasa or a school and a hostel for underprivileged boys. And it is just next to the historic Khan Jahan Mosque, which is a grade 1 building. It was earlier managed by the Archaeological Survey of India. And in spite of being a grade 1 building, the contemporary building is less than 1 meter away from it. So it is currently just maintained by the Muslim organizations in the city, and currently the government has no role. So only the local people and the people who occupy maintain this place. And this is just outside the Parkot Darwaza. The city wall boundary, there's a cluster of temples in ruins. There's an unused well. And this is a grade 2A building described by the 2016 Gazetteer. However, the condition still lies in ruins. This is how people have occupied the space and the entrance to the temple, which is not really accessible and lies unused. Next is the existence of few tombs, which are randomly around the settlement in the houses, and it's worshipped by people, and it is a part of their daily activities. Now, this entire stretch of Khan Jahan and its surrounding areas describes this sort of as a great beauty and interest. He says that there's a range of great informal and varied landscape of paths, tombs, temples, natural riverfronts, and it is the most striking excursion from the city. The varied landscape and certain religious practices exist even though the river no longer flows through this area. So moving ahead, we will see certain bastions. One of the darwazas that we discussed was Shad. So remains of the bastions are seen here. So one of the bastions which acts as a residence. The second bastion acts as a Muslim shrine. On top of it, there's a shrine. You access it through climbing a flight of stairs. This is the top of the bastion. Another bastion that is used as a residence. It is the cladding on the wall. And this is the different ways how bastions are being used. Now, the last area we should discuss of the Astoria Darwaza, the opening or the square near the Astoria Darwaza. So this is an image of the 19th century miniature style painting on cloth. Here we see the Sabarmati River flowing along the wall of Ahmedabad, and towards the southwest corner we see the enclosure that we saw earlier, the Khan Jahan enclosure. We see the Mahmuda Darwaza, which is the closed gate, marked in this map, and also below the lowest box we see the enclosure, which we are going to further see in detail. However, these enclosures seem to be missing in the dossier that's been submitted to the nomination committee. Okay, so now within the 100 meter, this structure lies within the 100-meter buffer zone of the Astoria Darwaza, which is under the ASI protected zone. It was earlier used as a leper asylum and during the colonial rule. And Geddes again mentions of this area as the finest of all the entrances and exits in the city and provides the finest opportunities for city development. He says that breaking the wall here would be a symbol of vandalism and a waste of beauty that is brought by extravagant labor, expense, and particularly to no purpose within the wall that is anymore with its concept. Now, after the nomination, so this is the architecture which clearly shows that it was built during the Mughal period. However, after receiving the World Heritage status, a part of it was demolished by the state transport, and it was demolished for the expansion of the state transport building, which you can see in the circle there. And the construction permission was then revoked after an aware local citizen brought this to the notice of the cultural minister. So currently the arguments are around justifying the demolition based on the official status of the structure. If it is, the ambiguity lies in the status, if it is in the graded heritage list, the tentative heritage list, or not in any list at all. So this top-down and bottom-up approach of identification and listing of monuments raises a question of ownership, decision-making, capacity, and responsibility of shared heritage. How can
You've got 1 minute.
How can the old and the new coexist and contribute additional value to any historicity? So in comparison to the museumification and mummification done by ASI and the Ahmedabad Municipal Committee in the other parts of the city, this stretch shows us the raw, unfiltered layer of history. And in context to this, we can go back to Geddes' suggestion that he said about citizens being more aware by city museum and city survey, which can still be implemented for the city. He said back in the time that citizens play a vital role in the continuity of heritage and its changing meanings, which we see through the example of walking through this stretch. And once dissociated from the people, the places that were once heritage become abandoned with no meaning or association. So unawareness of history and historic structures bring us to question.
Time is out. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we move to the next presenter. Nisha, are you ready? Go ahead.
Yes, right. Shall I share my screen?
Yes, go ahead.
Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Nisha, and thank you for being here today to hear my presentation, and I'm delighted to be here as well. My presentation is titled The Ecosystem of Transmission in Traditional Kutch Weaving, and I look at how artisans negotiate their traditional knowledge systems and safeguarding practices within the framework of UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention of 2003. In India, the production of heritage has largely been shaped by the authorized heritage discourse, which takes its cue from Western heritage practices. This has led to policies and interventions which arise out of a normalized discourse rather than from artisans' own perspectives. Recent works in the discipline of culture and heritage move away from discourses of repetitive or frozen cultural practices in need of preservation and see traditional craft communities as perceiving and actively interacting with modernity. UNESCO's 2003 Convention for Safeguarding ICH is the first international treaty addressing heritage of a non-material nature and is noteworthy for its stipulations of community involvement in safeguarding their intangible heritage practices. So to paraphrase, intangible heritage is defined as the practices, representation, expressions, knowledge, and skills that communities, groups, as well as the artifacts and objects that communities, groups, and in some cases, individuals transmit as part of their cultural heritage. This heritage, transmitted from generation to generation, is constantly recreated by communities and groups in response to their environment and provides them with a sense of identity and continuity. This holistic definition, which includes not just the objects of traditional craftsmanship, but also its situational, social practice and knowledge, allows for a paradigm shift within Indian craft discourse, which has historically focused on technical production and preservation of material tradition. Though the convention emphasizes the dynamic nature of ICH, its attempts to provide a non-prescriptive approach to safeguarding falls short through the rather static definition of safeguarding measures, which are defined as measures aimed at ensuring the viability of ICH, including identification, documentation, research, preservation, protection, which follows the same kind of safeguarding measures that tangible cultural heritage has. So this indicates an inability to reconcile the dynamism of transmission with historical modes of safeguarding methods. Inadequately developed methodology has led to governments tackling communities' roles in safeguarding in cursory and shallow ways. Current practices of appropriating the fluidity of ICH, which flows over a continuum of the past, the present, and the future, and freezing it into the present, pushes for an epistemological rethink of safeguarding frameworks. My fieldwork uses the repertoire of two master artisans and their interpretations of their environment and their responses vis-a-vis their own material culture to show how they are in a process of actively constructing their heritage. And it is through these particular active practices that their heritage is reconstructed and safeguarded. Recent scholarship on indigenous knowledge argues that it is virtually impossible to classify a body of knowledge as scientific or indigenous and to view transmission as following prescribed paths, since there's always been intimate contact between Western and indigenous cultures for centuries, which results in variation, communication, transformation, exchange, innovation, and learning. These are not distinct moments in an individual's life trajectory, but are an everyday practice whose meaning is continuously reconstructed through their life journeys and is essential to their identity and construction of their selves. In my ethnography, I analyzed these sites of transmission by using the narrative of two such experts, two such master artisans, and their interpretations of their environment and their responses to show how they're in this constant process of actively constructing their heritage. The concept of indigenous modernities creates a lens for my critical analysis by making visible practices that negotiate or oppose the dominant discourses. Hosagra's definition of the indigenous modernities as used in her work on built environments is a useful framework for looking at craft and traditional artisans as participants within the larger and dominant frameworks of modernity, but on their own terms. Here, indigenous emphasizes context and locality, and indigenous modernities denotes the paradoxical features of modernities rooted in their own particular local conditions and located outside the universal paradigm of an imagined West. It celebrates the simultaneity and engagement of both the traditional and the modern. Hosagra's analysis establishes how the dominant characteristics of modernity, such as technological processes, efficiencies, rationalism, were displayed in reinterpreted spaces on indigenous and local terms. I extended the same framework to make visible the alternate practices of intangible heritage, of transmission, safeguarding, and heritage by traditional artisans in Kutch from the weaving community. The history of Kutch has revealed that the area has been an economic tour de force for centuries. Much of its economic strength lay in the historic craft production of the region. Thus, using craft as a prism to view the changes that have shaped the social, cultural, and economic landscape of the region has much merit. For my fieldwork, I interacted with the traditional weaving community of Kutch, known by their caste name of Vankars. While the Vankar community of Bujodi possesses inherent similarities in their socio-cultural and technical practices, their market strategies are based on families' social and economic capital. Through two master artisans, Vankar Shamji and Vankar Purushottam, of their interpretation of their own craft journeys within the socio-historic context, I show how they display active practices of transmission and strategic safeguarding of their heritage. We now move on to the sites of transmission, which is their material culture. We start from the traditional dhabla or their shawl, which has stayed the same for over 400 years. Purushottam Bhai's story is not just his or his family's life histories, but a combination of placing their life histories within the larger social, economic, and political context, and his reflections on how those influence their practice. Purushottam Bhai spreads out an old dhabla, and he says, I learned from my father and grandfather. Both were weavers. I learned just by playing and watching. We used to weave for the rabaris. They would give us specific orders for dhablas, chanyas, odhnis, veils, and whenever we were free, we would weave. They would give us wool from their sheep. We would weave and in return get grains or oil. That was our market. For the rabaris, we wove only natural wool, white, black, and gray. We had our own workshop with about 25 artisans that we employed. My grandfather was quite settled in his work and also had connections in Bhuj. He started thinking about how to make the customers come to us rather than us go to them. With that in mind, he started a cooperative of weavers in 1954 so that everyone's wares could sell in one place. Now, analyzing what he says within the material culture of the dhabla, within the social and economic and the political context of that time, we see that this tangible piece of cloth was not a static entity, but one alive with embedded socioeconomic and cultural identities of the Vankars and their patrons for over 400 years. While the national discourse talks about government setting up cooperatives, the weavers were also actively reading the political climate of the time and deciding their own courses of action. In Purushottam Bhai's telling, it was his grandfather, Kheta Bhima Vankar's position in the community, combined with his initiative and political acumen, that led to the cooperative in Bujodi, which not only benefited the weavers by allowing them to procure yarn at better prices and giving them more negotiating power, it had the intentional added benefit of bringing Bujodi into the radar of government officials in the Kutch administration. Purushottam Bhai now spreads out a grey shawl in front of him. This has the traditional dhabla borders on the selvage, but the field is spaced out with a thick horizontal stripes of traditional motifs. He says, this was designed by Prashant, a neighboring weaver's family, his grandfather, many, many years ago. The selvage border is like a traditional dhabla, but the field has all over work inspired by the traditional dhabla. There is no machi tanko, which is a stitch used to join two lengths of shawls in between. It is full width. Now, when we look at written accounts and analyze the shawls of that time, we see that the period between the 1960s and 80s, new technology like fly shuttle looms started becoming available. The success of government intervention in craft has been well documented, but the changes in design, product, and material also hold weavers' journeys of adapting to changes in the ecosystem. Placing these within the historical context illustrates changes on the ground which elude archival techniques and documentations of material culture. This grey shawl that was emblematic of a successful design reinterpreted from the dhabla holds a place of importance within the community as their own success story. One which shows how they interpreted and navigated modernity and emerged from a highly localized network to a community with a tremendous amount of social capital. By staying aligned and cognizant of key design and technological events in the 20-year span between the 60s and 80s, weavers strengthened their safeguarding ecosystems. The iconic Bujodi shawl, which is this image, which signified the weavers' success for catering to large volumes in national and international markets, ironically also proved to be their downfall. Historical accounts see national policy, the textile policy of 1985, as a major factor contributing to the weavers' turn of fortunes. Purushottam Bhai does not just ignore the politics of the times, where protectional policies for handlooms were abolished and allowed power looms to come in as competitors. He introduces an other angle. He says, there is a rule that as something grows more desirable and popular, and when you try to cater to that, you start working less, weaving plainer and plainer cloth and easier designs in an attempt to keep up, then this becomes a danger to the place itself. If the power loom imitates what we do and the customer loses trust in our handwork, then the pride in our work goes, and it is a loss. Only if we keep that safe can we pass it on to the next generation. So through this statement, danger to the place itself, he alludes to how the weaver's practice, place, and identity are interlinked, and how close they came to losing that value. So this is a lesson that he and the others in the community hold close. So they don't just blame the national policies, but they say it is in their practice that they lost sight of what was important. And they see how they can take their practice forward. So he says, no one was buying our shawls. We decided to change our material completely. We got soft wool, which was more high value. We also incorporated the miri. If you can see the border, the blue and yellow border, that is the miri. The miri is typically woven on the edge of dabla so that the cloth doesn't open out. Now it has just become a design. But it is something that the power looms cannot replicate. And this is a way we can differentiate and tell our consumers that this is handloom. So though the weavers made use of opportunities offered by the government programs and other institutions, they've also pursued their own strategies for creating a safeguarding ecosystem in a new competitive environment. In the next section, when I talk to Shyamji Bai, I look at how I analyze the weavers' own safeguarding strategies to maintain the identity of the handloom in technical, social, and economic ways post the earthquake in a neoliberal environment. From a continuous history of national award-winning weaving and a strong network developed by his father, the family of Vishramji Walji, Shyamji Bai, and his brothers have developed their practice judiciously, utilizing the opportunities afforded by the political and social environment. Shyamji Bai constructs the foundations of how the Vankar's weaving tradition should be pursued. He says, if clients ask us to do plain cloth, we will do it for 2 or 3 months, but after that, we'll make them understand that this kind of work, the beauty we bring to our hand skills is lost. If for 10 years we only do plain cloth, then the skill in our fingers is lost and our mind can't clearly think of designs. Bring any Bujodi weaver's work to me, I will know who made it. We all know. It is inside the work, in the motifs, the traditional work, the way the design is placed is each family's own. Shyamji Bai's strategy of actively safeguarding their heritage is by constructing a cultural framework for his audience, whether they're designers, students, academics, craft organizations, or potential buyers. For Shyamji Bai, everyday practice is embodied in the term artisan. It includes not just an artisan's expertise, but is a manifestation of the attention and care given to every piece they weave. In describing the affective, emotive quality of the motifs, Shyamji Bai isn't merely aestheticizing his craft, but forcing us to think critically on how design is socially embedded into their practice and is a response to their environment. So Shyamji Bai has collected 100 pieces, more than 100 pieces from various parts of Kutch for the past 30 years, which he eventually wants to display in his own interpretive museum, hands-on museum. He uses these pieces variously to showcase their heritage to tourists, or to show how he reinterprets them for contemporary markets, or to share his research process with academics, and to pass on the richness of the vocabulary and proper design placement to the next generation of weavers. Through reinterpreting the meanings embedded in older pieces in different contexts, Shyamji Bai offers an active consumption of heritage, which is different from a museum experience. His deliberate circulation of the more successful interpretations of their designs and his emphasis that eventually all their designs belong to the whole community is a strategy to actively diffuse the individualism that is creeping in. For both Shyamji Bai and Purushottam, ensuring continuity of their practice entails a twofold strategy of pursuing higher education for their children while ensuring their situated practices continue. Purushottam Bhai says, "Our work brings us joy. We think this is what our grandfathers made. This our fathers made. This we made. What will our children make? We don't teach our children weaving, but we make them understand how much value this has. When they come of age, we will train them in the craft. In craft, you will get respect. Here, the whole world will come to you. You won't have to go to them." In conclusion, I'd like to say, I started this paper by developing the contradictions inherent within ICH's definition of transmission, which allowed for a fluidity of practice and its rather static engagement with safeguarding measures. Through my methodology, I developed an approach to safeguarding through artisans' own practices of transmission, which engages with the active constructing and reconstructing of heritage and its consumption. Using the transformations that we see here in this image of the dhabla, I showed how its reinterpretation reflect the artisan's response to social and economic upheavals. I also made visible the decision-making processes that weavers engage in to maintain the identity of the handwoven in technical, social, and economic ways, which contribute to their safeguarding ecosystem. The evolution of intangible practices does not necessarily depend on what elements have been transmitted, but rather understandings based on when they are put into practice. Socio-historic meanings are entangled in the sites of transmission, and these actively contribute to safeguarding practices and heritage construction. This constant tension between maintaining a continuity of inherited tradition and making adjustments within the social, economic, cultural, and technical contexts are what contribute to maintaining a safeguarding ecosystem. Recognizing and making visible this ecosystem, always taking into account its context specificity and temporality, allows for more robust and supportive policies by governments and international bodies. I'd like to conclude by acknowledging and thanking Bankar Shyamji Valji and Bankar Purushottam, whose research and reflection into their own community and its subsequent transmission to me as a researcher proved invaluable in my own work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nisha, for well-timed presentations. Actually, still have 2 minutes. Thank you very much. The next presenter is, the last but not least, is Anjali and the paper Spatial Networks and Intangible Heritage. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Let me change the background. Okay. So you have 20 minutes. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a second. I just lost my presentation.
It's your time.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Is my presentation visible?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I'm very glad that you're finally here after all the hiccups and all, postponing of the conference. I'll jump into it right away. So this paper is based on another craft practice, which is the bangle making in Firozabad. So moving on, this paper is based on an exploratory study on a traditional craft-based society of Firozabad located in North India. It aims to develop an alternative approach to the conceptualization of heritage, extending beyond the tangible to the intangible. It further sets out to argue that a new approach in understanding socio-cultural processes as spatial networks associated with the craft that augment the process of craft making becomes critical in contemporary times for self-sustaining these structures rather than having a product-centric approach. In this context, the paper brings forth the discussion at two levels, whether heritage can be established as a web of spatial networks and how this shift from product to process-centric approach results in a better sustenance of these intangible heritage systems in a contemporary society. Every craft product is a result of a complex process of production with both social as well as spatial aspects. Each step involves different social groups with specific skills and social roles in the line of production. Furthermore, the spaces within which these processes takes place provide the necessary backdrop and support for their sustenance. This is particularly seen in craft products with a traditional industrial base. With respect to traditional craft-based societies in the backdrop of material cultural studies and its production process, in the Indian context, the question that emerges are how often do we acknowledge the intangible cultural processes and tradition of a place when reading a craft-based society? Can there be a framework to develop an understanding of socio-spatial processes when considering a model of development for craft-based societies? Is there a tangible spatiality to the intangible cultural heritage? And consecutively, can heritage be established as a web of spatial networks as a manifestation of the craft process? Now let's quickly look at the premise within which the paper is set. First, the question of authenticity related to the perception of heritage as objects. As Bortolotto points out, that this obsession with heritage objects, which are fixed and static, needs to be replaced with inclusion of the process of reproduction and transmission of practices for adaptation by future generations. Second, as Antic emphasizes, economic growth ought to include deeper narratives about place, history, and heritage. With regard to the research methodology is based on a grounded theory approach. As you can see, what you see on in the image on the right is a thele wala. Thela is a cart, and the one who pulls it is called a thele wala. The thela wala, as you will see later, plays a very crucial role in the production process as he transports the material from one point of production to the other. Therefore, following on the actor network theory, notions of following the actors to build up explanations, the fieldwork entailed following the thelewala through the streets and fabric of the city of Firozabad and mapping the movement of a glass bangle. At this point, it's important to discuss the cultural significance of the glass bangle. Glass bangle is considered a cultural symbol of femininity in the Indian culture, symbolic of a woman's marital status. It also forms an important daily accessory still worn by women across the country on a daily basis. There are bangles for every occasion and ritual. Tracing the antiquity of glass bangles of modern times, Sankalya claims that it probably came into existence in the 14th century AD, with the settling of Persian Muslims in India. However, excavations in Kopia in Uttar Pradesh provide concrete evidence that the craft of glass bangle making existed as early as 656 BC. The craft of this cultural symbol now defines Firozabad's living and thriving cultural heritage, deeply intertwined into the daily lives of its inhabitants. So where is this town called Firozabad? Firozabad is a nondescript town on the outskirts of Agra, located on the riverbed Yamuna in India's largest state, Uttar Pradesh. To provide a point of reference, Agra is where Taj Mahal is located. Firozabad is an established center in glass bangle production, both nationally and internationally, and is known as the glass bangle capital of India. Firozabad witnessed the inception of glass and bangle making as a cottage industry in the early 16th century during the Mughal reign. And since then, it has continued to be the center of glass bangle production. In 2010, it produced 68,000 metric tons of glass bangles with an export value of $70 million. nearly 60% of the total population in Firozabad is directly involved in glass bangle making. The craft of glass bangle making has thus evolved in Firozabad for over 100 years, involving its people and the community as a whole. What you now see on the screen are the various steps in the production of a single bangle, which starts at the factory, traverses through the household units, and finally enters the retail chain. The production of bangle takes place both in the industrial unit as well as household units, as every single bangle traverses the entire length and breadth of the city. To give you a sense of the socio-cultural landscape, this is a short clip which will give you a sense of the kind of grain, the kind of people, and the kind of practices that one is talking about. So it should give you a good sense. And if you look at it, it's a very ordinary place. But what it brings out is the complexity of the practices which have been going on for many years. And also you will see that what seems to be a very linear process is actually quite complex and quite nuanced. So you can see these other different actors involved, and there are various steps. The field work so far has revealed that in the production of one single bangle, there are approximately 80 people involved. So we're talking about 80 people. So that's where is the thele wala. Moving on to the household units. So the glass bangles are an inherent part of the material culture of Firozabad. This artifact is representative of a knowledge system accumulated over centuries of exploration of the material itself, the technique, the skill, and the social systems associated around the act of bangle making. Its form, texture, color, and pattern is a byproduct of these interactions between the material and the craftsman, social and economic interrelationships, and the transforming nature of the craft itself. The various stages in the production of a single bangle, glass preparation, manufacturing, cutting, polishing, joinery, and decoration, involves exploiting the material specific to the use or application of the final product. This makes glass a primary factor
Anjali, are you there?
Lindsay, what should we do now?
Let's give her another minute. I'll send her a message. Maybe she's having some technical issue. Actually, she's gone from the room. No, there she is. Anjali, we lost you for a second.
Yeah, okay. Is my screen still visible? My screen visible now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. So the craft is therefore seen as a predominant factor in forming the socio-spatial network of the city. The daily life cycle of people engaged in craft at a community level follows a sequential rhythm that reflects the various stages of crafting of glass bangles. The activities are not in isolation, but is the sum total of all the work done by a majority of people involved in craft making. These activities, when looked at a city scale, decipher networks, movements, interactions of craft-related functions which define the process of craft, making it as it stands today. What emerges from this socio-spatial mapping are three main social roles or social categories in the process of craft. The merchant, who is the owner of the factory and raw material, the craftsman or the skilled laborer who works on the material, and the retailer. These three functions are not in any rigid socio-economic containers as seen in Firozabad. They may overlap, intersect, or combine themselves, forming socio-economic network across the city. This results in the craft to be spread across the city rather than be confined to the factory spaces on the outskirts of the city. Different people engage themselves at different stages of the craft process, linked through a socio-spatial web. In this entire process, every Firozabadi resident finds himself in a unique position as a social actor were actively or inactively contributing to the act of bangle making. Such a social capital in the city of Firozabad is a living testimony where a glass-based craft is centric to the way of life of an entire community engaged in the business of glass making. Further, a positive relationship exists between social capital and the intensity of social network use, wherein social capital is a form of economic, cultural capital, and social networks are its focus. Each step in the craft of glass bangle making leads itself deeply penetrated into the domestic life of the people. Next, in the context of craft of glass bangle in Firozabad, craft can be conceptualized as an embodied knowledge and an expression of collective action and social identity. The craft of bangle making requires skill at all stages. Borrowing from Merleau-Ponty, it is this, quotes open, I can, quotes close, type of knowledge which is at work without any thinking as to the resultant craft object. The intricate use of colors, patterns, geometries entail a certain degree of dexterity and craftsmanship towards the final product. At a community scale, the craft begins to interlace the various social actors within the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors of the settlement through the process of embodied knowledge. Further, Costin articulates the craft product as a social object that intersects with all cultural domains. He further points out that these objects signify and legitimize group membership and social roles and are reserves of wealth, storing intrinsically valuable materials and the labor invested in their manufacture. The glass bangle, in the case of Firozabad, is that social object which defines the complex interrelationship between the place and the people and provides them with their unique cultural identity. It is this articulation of craft that forms the premise for reading the craft of glass bangle in Firozabad within the intangible cultural heritage domain. An analysis of the social structure and the craft process as seen in the video clip leads to an understanding the identities of those who are craft producers. The thele wala, judai wala, jhalai wala, tudai wala, karigars and others are different nomenclatures imparted to the people involved in the craft making process that provides them with their social identity. Craft production, therefore, is creating personhood, defining social categories and social relationships. The social identity so created has its own prerogatives such as autonomy, control, power, privilege, and prestige, where gender, age, marital status, rank and class, ethnicity, legal status, and ritual status form different components of the social identity. So what emerges from this? Kanch Nagari, or the glass city, as Firozabad is also termed, personifies the phenomenon of bangle making. Known for the craft, the city has a spatial organization that augments and stimulates the craft making process. A closer look into the spatial structure of the city reveals a thorough simplicity, efficiency, and logic in its relation to the process of crafts itself. In the simplest of terms, the arrangement of the process is based on the convenience required to transport the material from the first stage to the final product, thereby generating a social capital and movement networks along the path of bangle making. This phenomenon provides a unique approach in understanding craft practices and its intervention into already existing traditional way of life. The emerging socio-spatial networks in a settlement that get established over a period of time through this self-generated process, chance encounters and trials and errors creates a socio-spatial capital, all its tangible heritage. So what are the ways of promoting the craft community and sustaining these systems? The Prime Minister, in his Independence Day speech in 2019, said that time has come to think about how we can boost exports. Each district has so much to offer. With the intention of promoting traditional industries in India that are synonymous with the respective districts of the states, One District, One Product scheme was launched. It aims at creating product-specific traditional industrial hubs across 75 districts of Uttar Pradesh that will promote traditional industries that are synonymous with the respective district of the state. Furthermore, Ministry of Small and Medium Enterprises has defined various points as basis and presumption for a unit of glass bangle as a product item, and one point is worth noting. Quotes open, The process of joining liquid gold, silver, and other types of decoration have not been incorporated in the profile, and these can be done from a number of cottage units on piece rate basis. Quotes closed. It is critical to note that while the stages of glass bangle making are executed by the cottage units, that is the residential household, the socio-spatial networks that link these residential units with the factory units of the settlements remain unrecognized. As mentioned above, the approach to these craft clusters seems predominantly product-oriented, geared towards imparting skill to labor and employment generation. So to conclude, it is observed that wherever the policies are centered around the product, the existing spatial networks that are result of a long-run process of evolution, community interaction, and embodied knowledge systems often face a certain friction in reorganizing themselves. Although they do allow for increased production of the craft product, leading to hasty economic activity, a non-recognition of these networks may lead to disturbance in the network hierarchy, which in turn create a ripple effect to the existing socio-cultural spatial fabric. Merely capitalizing on human resources and removing associated social and cultural and spatial capital may place a threat to these intangible heritage structures of these craft-based economies. Recognition of these dynamic networks as intangible heritage is critical as it allows for and stimulates innovation, work-live relationship, leisure, gender balance, and long-term communal sustenance. These embodied knowledge networks are crucial for envisaging a future that is rooted in sustainable livelihood and inclusive growth. It also enhances the unique and authentic cultural identity of the community engaged in the craft. If frozen in space and time, this intangible heritage may gradually be lost forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Nisha, for a very well timed presentation, very informative. We have now time to we have almost half an hour for Q&A. Let me first go over the abstracts that I've read and the presentations, and I would like to make some comments. I'll start with Dr. Ren, and I think he did a very good job in presenting those Chinese ancestral temples, bowls. To a certain extent, maybe because he didn't have the time, I didn't get what's the implications of the research, but I'm sure he has an answer for that. Now, for the three papers from India, yesterday when I was reading and preparing for today, the three came across my mind, the book by Henry Leviev, The Production of Space. I feel it very much here. And I think one of the paper about Ahmedabad, when Sweta was discussing about what Patrick Geddes has written, documented, maybe you might think to examine his writings from, an occupier point of view, Eurocentric perspective, to see the bias in the way he observed the city and at that time. As for the third presentation, I think the research approach is very novel in comprehending and relating socio-cultural processes with spatial and geographic networks, which is very nice. I really enjoyed it. Lastly, but not least, Anjali showed an issue which is very important, and I think has to be discussed more about how the spatial networks are the product of socio-cultural processes and the friction that takes place once the government or the state start to focus on the product, which is very, I think also if you have the time, or you can look into analyzing that from a political economy point of view. Very much, I enjoyed the 4 presentations, and let me put this, the view into gallery, and let me see some hands. If someone has a question, because we still have time. Hello? Everyone is content. So maybe let's start with Dr. Ren to reflect on my comments. Maybe we'll see some hands to be raised. Okay, please, Dr. Ren, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Ahmed. Thank you for these opportunities. In terms of your query about research implications of my paper, I think that is the one I missed in the final verbal concluding thoughts, and that is the one wanted to shifting from the focus of objects as a heritage from this Chinese ancestral hall to the idea of social spatial practice. It is an architectural idea, but also it is a practice, because without the practice of ancestral worship rituals, there's no sense of place of a ancestral hall, only a skeleton physicality of a building. So that's my, I would say that's my key statement for this implication.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Ren. Sweta, you want to say something?
Not really. I think a suggestion to look at it from Lefebvre's perspective of seeing it in the perceived, conceived, and the lived space, like you suggested, I think that would be a different perspective to look at it. So I'll definitely try to relook at the paper in that lens.
Good, thank you. Nisha?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ahmed. I think I was happy that you noticed that there was a novel approach, because that's really what I wanted to focus on, where, usually craft documentations focus on the technical and the material. And I wanted to explore a way where intangible heritage is understood more in the socioeconomic and political context of the time and as sites of knowledge. So that's the approach I was going with.
Thank you, thank you. Angelia?
Yeah. So thank you, Professor. So, Professor Ahmed, like you said, that the study should be looked at in terms of the, looking at it in terms of political and economic point of view. So that was kind of out of scope of the paper, and this paper was written at a much earlier time, and the research has kind of further developed, where the research is trying to look at the socio-economic aspects of the craft production process, and the implication that it has on the speciality at multiple levels, in terms of the city, in terms of the neighborhood, and also the work-live relationship. So the house itself, where the practice is taking place, is actually a confluence of a work-live relationship and work and live kind of deeply intertwined with each other. So the research is now kind of focused and progressed into looking at even looking at issues of labor. So do you look at people involved in these practices as labor or as craftsmen? Because the government is coming from the perspective of labor, and that is what is causing the friction and causing a big threat to the existing spatial networks, which are very important for the sustenance of the craft. So that's what it is.
Excellent. I see that Mark Gillum unmuted his microphone. Oh, he muted it.
Here we are.
Hey, greetings.
Okay. Yes,
Greetings.
yes, Mr. President.
Well, those were wonderful papers. I did have a question for Nisha. First of all, the graphics on your slides and the coloring on your slides, I mean, it was as beautiful as the fabric and the tapestry you were showing. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more. I know you did a bit, but if you could speak a little bit more on, the built environment and how that relates to the making of tapestry and the making of fabric, and what changes you have seen in the built environment, whether it's the urban landscape or the architecture or the planning. But if you can connect a little bit more the role of the built environment in the making of these wonderful tapestries, that would help me understand it a bit more.
Sure. So it's interesting that you talk about the built environment because in 2001, Bhuj, Kutch especially had a terrible earthquake where the entire traditional built environment was destroyed, of all the craftsmen and artisans, and every community had to rebuild. And the government, though they did say, we're going to help you and help you rebuild your traditional sort of spaces. There wasn't that much coming. There wasn't that much support coming from them. And the people actually sort of rebuilt on their own, in their own ways, from whatever they had. And specifically the weavers, because of the way their craft is structured, interestingly, the built environment, though they did want to modernize, they wanted, traditionally it's built out of mud and they have little glass mirror work embedded into the walls in the structures. So they did start using concrete, but the plan of the homes, the plan of their homes followed the traditional way where there's a courtyard in the middle and there's sort of a U-shaped structure around it with the family living on one end, and the other end has the looms and the work area. And people come into the courtyard and they sit, and that's how they entertain their buyers or anybody else who comes to visit. And this, in every house that you see, this traditional structure has prevailed because that helps them produce. The entire family is involved in production. So they have the looms, the warping, the bobbins, spinning, everything. The women of the household are in that process. The children, when they're younger, though they don't learn the craft of weaving, they're involved in all the ancillary processes. So the structure of the homes is set up in such a way that the entire family can be involved in all these processes. So as far as the plan of the layout goes, it has still continued in that traditional way, and which helps their whole production of their tapestries, their crafts.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see, mass production and the role of capitalism changing how this whole process happens? How do you see that changing both the making of the fabrics, the weaving of the fabrics, and the place itself where they're made?
So what has happened interestingly in Kutch, which I touched a little bit upon my presentation, my paper deals with it in more detail, is during the 80s when mass production started happening because of the move to acrylic and the fly shuttle looms. That's when they realized that the power looms could copy, because they started simplifying their designs. And the power looms easily started copying them, and they flooded the market with the Bajoti shawls and their weaves. And around 1997, that their business had really flagged. It had reduced to almost nothing. And I think at that point, the weaving community was kind of thinking about what to do. And in 2000, as they were planning that out, the earthquake hit. And post the earthquake, when looms were destroyed, everything, their whole profession was destroyed. So post that, the government sort of started giving in a lot of money into the area. But the weavers of their own accord decided that we are not going to cater to a mass market anymore. We have to preserve our identity. We are going to resurrect ourselves, rehabilitate ourselves, and we are going to continue with what is our identity, which is why they will do a little bit of mass production. They will do some plain weaving. They've had clients, they've had Peter England, Urban Mills, large clients coming to them, asking them for plain cloth. So they'll do a little bit for their bread and butter, but they will not, they will always have 4 or 5 looms engaged in traditional production, because they say that, plain cloth can be, anyone can do it, but this is our identity and we cannot do. So they have come up with a definite approach to protect their craft, because they know that this cannot be copied. And they're not going to cater to the high volume business at all. They will not do yardage. Mm-hmm. And that is a definite strategy that they have all as a community come together and decided.
Well, thank you. Dr. D, you have a question for Sweta?
I did. I had a question actually for Sweta as well as for Anjali, but I'll start with Sweta first. What's the shift that had the most influence on the Fort Wall of Ahmedabad and why? And I was also interested to know what you think, if you could grab a little more funding, what would you carry forward? What area of the wall would you kind of want to focus on?
So I think it was during the independence period when the power shifted from the British rule to the local government, where Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel came into power, and when they tried to remove the congestion of the built city and how the wall was broken down. So at the time, I wasn't able to reach out to a lot of documents that were made during the independence time because they were with the Ahmedabad Municipal Commissioner. So it was very difficult to access them. But I think that is the most, so the demolition happened during that time. So I think that was the most, the period during which the most changes happened. And next, if I had the funding to do so. So now after the World Heritage title, I would like to see how changes are happening after the World Heritage title that has been given to the city. So that would be an interesting study to see after after getting the World Heritage, how does this go forward? How do people, how does the approach of the government change in different stretches that exist? How does the approach of the people change? And if visitors who are visiting, how does that change? Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
You have. That was really interesting. Thank you. Before I move on to Anjali, I wanted to make sure I got into, there's one question in the chat box. This is for Chiang Ren. It's by Felipe Lanuza Riling. And he wanted me to pass off a comment. He said, Chiang, very interesting presentation. Thank you so much. Number one, would you say a bit more about the current situation of those clans and therefore the condition and use of those buildings nowadays? And there's a two-part question. Part two, is the spatial arrangement of sequential layers or thresholds unique to this typology, or is it a feature of more traditional Chinese architecture?
Thank you, Lindsay and Felipe, for your questions. So second question, easier to answer. Yes, it's unique to this particular building type, which is not a general characteristic in Chinese traditional architecture in all those other secret building type. It's very unique. Your first part of the question, the current status of the clan, yes, it is decaying, and they still have that more traditional way of life and forming their own small societies within that geographically isolated villages. So they still share the same surname, and they still have that practice of festivals, harvesting in ancestral. They still believe in their common ancestors, but because of the ongoing very rapid dramatic form of urbanization in China, and most of the working population in the villages has been dragged out of the village for the most of the time of the year. So the current status of the ancestral hall is very, very severely decaying. I would say most of the time of the year it is vacant and disused, only with a few elderly looking after it. So it is decaying, and in terms of the clan itself, but also this building type. That's, I think, the contemporary relevance of the research of this decaying building type, which more or less respond to Ahmad's early question.
Very good, very good. Thank you. And last but not least, Anjali, I wanted to circle back and ask you a little bit about the idea of tacit knowledge, specifically because my research has some familiarity in it. I worked with the Hyderabad Urban Lab a few years back, and they were just starting up this tacit knowledge urban research network, TURN, which essentially addresses the idea of informality in knowledge production and how it kind of shapes the city and knowledge processes. And so they put a label on it and call it tacit knowledge. But it's really that place-based knowledge that focuses on kind of the making over time and how people just kind of inherently, people of a specific place inherently know how to get things done, know how to do things. And it's very much based in that idea of craft that you talk about. And so as you gave your whole presentation, I just kept thinking more and more about the synergy between it, and thinking that it really seemed like what you talked about could give us a lot of lessons about how that tacit knowledge, especially in the context of India and the two cities that you worked with, shapes those urban networks over time.
Yeah. So Lindsay, so Firozabad is just one, and the other study that I have done is Moradabad, and if the pandemic wouldn't have set in, the idea was to generate similar kind of understanding of tacit knowledge, and it's how they generate the speciality of such towns within Uttar Pradesh. So the idea was to create a repository of such tacit knowledge, translating into the urban networks that they create. So these are the kind of towns that one is talking about. They are not really they're not really urban in nature, which makes the study very complex as well as very interesting, because it's a it's a semi-urban kind of thing, and they are transiting from rural to urban. So it's a kind of a mixed situation, and that's why I had put in that short video clip, because it gives you a flavor that these are not really towns and these are not really cities in the Indian context, and hence that also has an implication on the continuity of the and the generation of the tacit knowledge. So what one has found is that the household where these practices take place is very critical in terms of both transmission of this tacit knowledge from one generation to the other, because it was not possible to show it in the presentation, but if you look at the pattern of production, it is very interesting how the pattern of production is deeply intertwined with the daily lives. So for example, the households finish their the breakfast in the morning, and by that time the raw material or the raw bangles are ready. They come in, people the entire household, including children, work on it. The production stops. That batch of bangles are ready. They are moved on to the next point. Then the lunch happens. Then the household chores can be completed, and then there is another round of it. So that also is that is what one is trying to map as well through these studies. And in terms of therefore the tacit knowledge production as well as transmission really happens in these household units, and that was one of the reasons of focusing on craft practices which are not particularly completely handicraft based, which Nisha is kind of looking at, because she's looking at these are purely handicrafts where kind of families have traditionally been involved, whereas craft like the glass bangles in Firozabad or the brass industry in Moradabad, and similarly other traditional craft clusters, provides a mix of these industrial production system and household units, and which makes this study very interesting. After writing the paper, the research has kind of moved on to looking at the extent of participation of future generations, their willingness to participate, and how they will kind of continue. So I hope that kind of broadly answers the question or brings insight in terms of how the tacit knowledge is being produced and the networks are kind of emerging out of it.
Absolutely. And I think it brings up really important points about the non-urban context and the importance of tacit knowledge, even in the formation of the structures. So that's something that's given me a lot to reflect on too. Yeah.
Let me ask a question to our presenters. usually when you do a qualitative research, you're looking into a process, and then you reach something about how a phenomenon emerged. And you might provide a kind of a recommendation or something like that. So based on your work on the ground, how you can scale up whatever you've seen in your cases into kind of a regional or a national policy. Anyone would like to respond to my question? Hello? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. I will be keeping short. I think in terms of my case, Chinese Ancestral Hall, because it is a public building type and it is losing, it is decaying, and I think there's an opportunity. It's a collective opportunity to reconstruct a kind of collective self from and through this kind of public building. So it's building not just about objects or space or function, but it's about place and ritual. And that place and ritual is something related to what you discussed, tacit knowledge. It is something not easily to be viralized or digitalized. And that is something very important to form the identity of a specific group. And I think in terms of scale up, I think this relates to the current very rapid construction of public buildings in Chinese cities, which most of them are being swallowing up those nearby villages. So they being part of the new city, new towns, but how to constitute the new identities through public buildings, I think Ancestral Hall can provide a very special lens.
Excellent. Yes, Nisha, I see you raised your hand.
Yeah. So actually my plan was after I finished Kutch, my fieldwork was going to move pre-pandemic into West Bengal, where I was going to apply the same methodology to the weavers of Bengal, which is a much larger space. You know, there are thousands of weavers there as opposed to Kutch, which is 300 or 400. And I wanted to see if this method of looking at the social, political, and historical context and getting master artisan stories and drawing parallels between them and looking at the evolution of their work can develop into a consistent methodology, which would actually more than government. My first idea was to, because I also work in institutions, was to work with design students and come up with better ways of documentation, which aren't just about looking at how to have something done.
Excellent. Yeah. Sweta?
So in my case, I believe that it would be to look at Patrick Geddeson's recommendation of looking at the civic survey, civic exhibition of the fourth wall, which was in place, and also the recommendation that he wrote for other cities in the country and how was it acted upon. So maybe try to understand this comparison of Ahmedabad with other cities that Patrick Geddes has written recommendation for. So maybe a comparative study in the long run could make us understand whether this top-down, bottom-up approach is applied to other cities. So which one works out the best for the people, which one is accepted by, so maybe something like that.
Excellent. Angela?
Yeah.
Anjali?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said earlier, so the study we first is, I started first with Firozabad, then moved on to Moradabad, so the same kind of study method in terms of the same methodology in terms of following a product or an actor through the fabric of the city. So and unfortunately the pandemic happened, and the idea was to look at within the same socio-economic cultural setting of one particular state, which is Uttar Pradesh. So when I conducted the study in Moradabad, yes, it was possible to scale it up, conceptually. The spatial networks did emerge, similar kinds of spatial networks where communities and clusters and located all across the city, and a spatiality emerging from the production process emerged, but with its own specificities. So Bangle as a product versus a brass, if you look at a vase or a container, is quite big. And one I had begun to see that, for example, the street layout was actually kind of being defined by the size of the product. So one found out that the fabric is very similar in terms of its nature, but in terms of its specificity, it's changed. So it's the same kind of network of street, but the streets were wider in Moradabad as compared to Firozabad. So yes, it is. One has already begun to see that yes, it is possible to scale it up. And what is interesting is that one had begun to see similar systems, but of course with its own specificity. So so the production process translating itself into the structure of the city. So
excellent.
Yeah, so those were some of the reflections on.
Okay, my last question would be, how do you see your work in terms of localizing sustainable development in the light of the Agenda 2030 and SDG 11, which is specifically for resilient urban settlements? You might think there is a linkages or a way what you're doing here could support the execution or attaining the targets of SDG 11 or any other SDG of the 17. Because what I've seen in the work here, you're speaking about resource recovery, about recycling, about making the community resilient and building networks, which is at the heart of sustainable development. Sustainable development is a kind of a paradigm shift in development approach at large. And our communities in developing countries need it very much. Yes, there is a hand here, Sweta.
Okay, so I think with the Agenda 2030, which says that like everybody should be involved and everybody should be a part of whatever development
Excellent.
is. So in this case, when we are saying that,
but let me put first here. When you say should, I think you should. One of the things is tell us how to get them involved.
yes,
You know what I mean? That's my what I'm trying here. How to form kind of a coalition to defend the wall, or something about the garments, or something about those Bengalis. See what I mean?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is awareness, raising awareness among the people, like in case of Nisha's presentation, where she says that the community has themselves decided that they are not going to mass produce. So I think that is what from within the community as well, because they know the value of their product or the heritage that they have themselves. Now, in case where a local resident wrote to the ministry that that this enclosure has been raised down, so you need to really question. So I think the first part is that the citizens should be aware, and then again now going back to Patrick Geddes, where only when if there is an exhibition or a survey is when people get to know, because unless until you are exposed to it, I think a lot of people are not aware of what lies around them. So I think one of them would be to create exposure and making people more educated with what they have.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, Professor Ahmed, I don't have really an answer, but I think what is happening in the context of my study is that since unlike Nisha's kind of craft processes that she's looking, where the community is much more organized, and the onus of the craft and the craft process lies solely on the community. In my context, it's a mishmash of industrial production and as well as craft processes happening. So it's quite complex. But the further study has revealed that the community, a certain set of people associate with themselves with it. They would like to continue with it because they say that that's the only thing they know, right? The city, if you go to the city breeds bangles, the city breeds glass. There is nothing else that they know, right? But at the same time, because of the economic aspects and economic aspirations, they want to kind of move out. Having said that, since the government has declared the one district, one product scheme, the economic value, the export value of the product lies in the fact that it cannot be solely mechanized, right? Because the moment it completely becomes mechanized, it will lose its export value because it's not handmade anymore. So in terms of your question, those are the kind of complexities that kind of come forward in the context of my study. So I don't know if that's really answered, but it kind of, those are the difficult questions, whether one can achieve those sustainable goals or not.
I have those questions because I didn't have the answers. I thought you might give me the answers. Thank you very much. Yes.
Yeah.
Dr.
Maybe we can find them together. Yeah.
Yes, that's what the conference is all about. I mean, we sit together and discuss about it, and maybe we get some shared idea, networking together. I think the whole thing is about, it's very political, because if you want to organize people, that's political. You want to raise awareness, that's kind of enlightening the people and empowering them, which is, at the end of the day, it's still political. See what I mean? So, and also there is a point here about the practitioners and the scholars and the way they think, the way they perceive the issue. Maybe it's different than from that of the people who live the problem itself. Yes, Dr. Ren, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I'm just checking the SDG goals, and I think my more relevance will be 3, the well-being, and the 11, the sustainable communities, because China is currently undergoing that transition from clan communities to the modern communities, which you see from the neighborhood unit. And I think that kind of cohesion can be achieved by this kind of reinvention of the traditional building type, like ancestral hall.
Yes. Excellent. Thank you very much. We still have 4 minutes. Let me change the background. So I hope if you
don't need to change the background for yourself. You have so the idea of changing the background is to just basically tell the speaker stop. I think you guys have produced a fabulous session. You have about 3.5 minutes left, and I just wanted to make sure that I thank and acknowledge all of you for putting together a very exciting session. I was moving between all 3, and I ended up actually staying and hearing all of the presentations in this session. So by and large, the other thing that we wanted to also say is that we will have a number of other networking breaks, which are supposed to be things like receptions, which are not happening right now. So when such things happen, and I know that Mark is very keen on that, go and get your glass of wine or get your coffee or tea, depending on what time of day it is. It's only 8:30 here in the morning in the Pacific West Coast. So I'm going to go and get my coffee, but I just wanted to make sure that I thank you all and thank Ahmed for also chairing this very good session.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all of you.